The federal election is coming up on October 21st. What are some of the big issues that Albertans are facing? What is near and dear to our hearts? To talk more about it is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, obviously the TMX pipeline expansion is front and center, as is the carbon tax.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the issues for Albertans going into this election and in the opening, week or so of this election, are many of the same issues that we've been seeing for months and months and months. I mean, people still want to know when the pipelines are going to be built, how relations between the BC government and Indigenous groups and the federal government might work under an Andrew Scheer government, for example. Carbon tax. If Trudeau wins, well, then we know what's happening with that, I suppose. But if another party wins, what's the environmental setup going to look like? But there's lots of talk so far about jobs, the economy, all these sort of perennial issues that aren't necessarily exclusive to Alberta. When Trudeau was here in Edmonton the other week, he spoke about that and support for Alberta and support for the oil industry, which he was speaking to a room full of Liberals, so that was certainly one thing. But I think a lot of the concerns that we are seeing are similar over the past year, and if well, I was going to say if Andrew Scheer wants to pick up seats in Alberta, but I don't think there's any question he's going to pick up seats in Alberta. But he, I don't think, is having to campaign to Alberta in the same sort of way that Justin Trudeau perhaps does if he wants to retain his 4 seats. We're we're in the can already, perhaps, for the Conservatives once voting day comes.
I think a big part of it as well, Tyler, is the fact that Albertans don't want to feel so isolated from Ottawa. That's why we're seeing some of these separatist parties popping up.
Yeah, and we do have Maxime Bernier's PPC as well, the People's Party of Canada. I'm not sure it's going to make much of an influence, but during the Alberta election, people did talk about the Freedom Conservative Party, which did have a member in the Alberta Legislature, and expected them to pick up a seat or two, and that didn't happen. People, went with the safe mainstream option in Jason Kenney's United Conservatives. So will this People's Party of Canada that's tracking a little bit to Andrew Scheer's right, will they pick up any votes, any seats? I suspect not, but you never know. There could be a riding or two that swings one way where people are a special brand of angry.
Let's talk foreign funding inquiry. There's now a website where the public can leave tips. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so this was, one of the big developments, I suppose, in how this was all going to be working. And the website, as you said, is set up. There's submissions. It has drawn immediate comparisons to sort of McCarthyism, reporting on your neighbor sort of thing. But presumably the idea is that you will have people that have, who have done some of the research, maybe looking through some corporate documents, some charity documents, who've read some of the research out there, who have perhaps some unique insight into these things, who make submissions on it. You never really know about these things when you go and ask the public. I mean, it's good, I think, the government does reach out to the public and is doing consultation, but you end up with an awful lot of information to sift through, not all of it necessarily super useful. So there is going to be a pile of information that has been sent to the government that this panel is going to have to go through and figure out what is legitimate and what's, who knows, someone angry at their neighbor. It could be a mess.
Our Premier Jason Kenney is feuding with Amnesty International. That's kind of a bit of a shock, a bit of a surprise. What is the fight all about?
Yeah, so it's sort of about this war room potential lawsuit kind of stuff that the Coles Notes version is Amnesty sees the war room and the inquiry into foreign funding as a free speech issue. And they see this as government power being used to sort of silence, whether you want to call them dissident groups or merely a political entity that the premier and the government don't agree with. So that's their concern. And which is one actually that I've asked Jason Kenney about in interviews and things like that. And he does not see it as a freedom of speech issue, to put it mildly. And his response was quite a remarkable letter that he sent back to Alex Neve, the head of Amnesty International Canada, and said, well, you guys got to find something better to do. I mean, we're talking about Alberta, we're talking about a place with gender equality, with industrial standards, with environmental standards, and perhaps attention should be spent on Saudi Arabia and Iran and Venezuela and all these other places. So it was a very fiery dispatch from the premier, and I know Rex Murphy in the National Post said it was an uncommon sort of thing in this era for such clarity from a politician. And whether you agree with Jason Kenney or not, it was quite a forceful missive, and something you really don't see very often anymore.
The province is in court over Bill C-69, or the No More Pipelines Act, as Jason Kenney likes to refer to it. Alberta's asking the Court of Appeal whether or not the bill is in fact constitutional. Now, the same thing happened with the carbon tax, and late last month, Ontario appealed its challenge of the carbon tax to the Supreme Court of Canada. Tyler, does Kenney really stand a chance here?
It's a great question, and I don't know. The government obviously thinks they do, or they think there's political points to be won in fighting these battles. Certainly, some of the arguments that have been made, particularly on the carbon tax, particularly in Saskatchewan, are they are operating on the margins of constitutional law, as one professor put it to me some months ago. The question is really one of jurisdiction, right? Does the province have sort of exclusive jurisdiction over pipelines, over the environment, or is it an area of mixed jurisdiction, or is it an area of exclusively federal jurisdiction? And on the carbon tax specifically, the government has been saying, well, this is an issue that affects all of Alberta, all of Saskatchewan, all of Manitoba, all of the country. And so you can't have one provincial government making policy that's going to affect everyone in the country. So that seems to have been a compelling argument so far on the carbon tax. Whether or not that's going to be the similar sort of argument that's made on C-69, I think we'll have to wait and see. I don't know if this is going to be successful, but certainly I think the Kenney government is probably hoping that we see an Andrew Scheer victory in a couple weeks so that they actually don't have to fight these battles in court.
Tyler, Premier Kenney is on a tour in the United States and Eastern Canada. Why is he racking up all the air miles?
Well, if he racks those points up and saves them for later, he could save the taxpayers money on an Aeroplan flight or something like that. But he's there, promoting Alberta energy, promoting investment in Alberta, talking about corporate tax cuts, trying to drum up enthusiasm for bringing business here. All these are sort of things that he promised that he would do once he became premier, that he was going to attract investment, all this kind of stuff. So, it's a speaking tour. He's been on, I believe, Fox News Network talking about these things. He's given speeches, met with politicians, the usual kind of stuff. It is part of, I think, this larger strategy wherein he made these sort of economic promises, and now he has to find a way to keep them. And I am, of course, always a skeptic that government can do a whole lot on the economy. They can, open things up, free things up a bit, but maybe unfortunately a lot of it ends up being outside of their control. So I think that this is, one strategy that the premier has to employ in hopes that we do get an economic return in the next several years. So he's doing that. He's also, as a result of doing that, sitting a little bit out of the federal election so far, which is kind of interesting since he had promised to be a little more involved in that. So that is, I wouldn't say I'm surprised per se, but it is interesting to see him on this campaign while there's an election campaign going on at the same time.
Now, I'm wondering what kind of an ROI that Kenney will actually get after meeting with some of the business leaders, especially south of the border in New York. Remains to be seen what will happen there. We also have an official date for the legislature returning. Tell me more about that.
We do indeed, October 8th. So they are scheduled to come back a little bit early. The sort of initial set date was about 3 weeks later than that, and they're going to be coming back early before the federal election, which probably makes some sense. There are going to be, a dozen, give or take, bills that they are planning on looking at. There's going to be a budget. That's probably the biggest ticket item that we are looking for out of this fall session. As viewers will remember, there was no budget after Kenney won in the spring, and there have been some sort of financial updates since then. But we actually have not got a super clear, super detailed look at the province's finances from the government other than the McKinnon report. So the budget is going to be a look at, we have had these quarterly financials, we have the McKinnon report, we have campaign promises. Sometime in October, probably the government's going to have to, squish that all through a funnel and have a budget come out the other end. And that's going to be a really solid first time look, I think, at how Jason Kenney's Conservatives plan to govern this province differently than their predecessors.
A Global Affairs Canada body identified a large amount of trolls and bots on social media during the last provincial election here in Alberta. It says the UCP had nothing to do with it, even though most of the active accounts were UCP enthusiasts.
Yeah, it's a very weird sort of situation because we often think of interference and misinformation as this, the Russian boogeyman or these troll factories in Macedonia. But this was sort of homegrown rabble-rousers, so to speak, who were pro-UCP, and some other accounts as well that were actually pro-People's Party of Canada. So sort of a weird scenario, and the government, keeps track of these things, and they did identify some sort of known sort of far-right neo-Nazi type actors involved in this. They didn't name any of those people or any of those organizations, which was a tad odd, I thought. But they were keeping track of this. But they, basically they couldn't find any nefarious foreign activity. There were just some sort of strange things going on, and not nearly significantly enough to disrupt the process. Certainly the UCP was not involved in this. Certainly this is not calling into question the legitimacy of the election, but it was a sign that, even in a provincial election, there were some of these weird things going on, even if they're domestic. And I'm sure that in a few months we will get another report saying that very similar things happened during the federal election.
The Globe recently had a story on red tape reduction that would be of some interest. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting document. So basically, there's a submission website for red tape, similar as we were discussing earlier about the War Room foreign funding stuff. And people submitted all sorts of things, and it is a real grab bag of stuff. There are, for example, when you talk about minimum wage, there are people who are concerned about the minimum wage cut for those under 18, not because they necessarily oppose it, but because it creates paperwork for business to keep two separate sort of pay sheets. So there's things like that, legitimate discussion of red tape, perhaps. There's a complaint about having to get a fireworks permit on your property. There's things like that. And then there's all sorts of just sort of quite funny stuff. An awful lot of people said, well, this is really ironic. How is a ministry of red tape reduction reducing red tape when you're creating more government? Or there's people that say, well, the pipelines, we should only build them downhill so that gravity, helps the oil along and saves us money. So, there's some obvious jokes. There are some serious recommendations. There are quite a few serious recommendations as well, but they're actually not provincial responsibility. You've got, things on criminal law and gun control. These are federal issues. So it is a real wide mix. It's about 500 pages long, a few thousand submissions, and this is only sort of the first chunk of that. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stuff for government to sift through in order to pick out some of the gems. And there are some gems, and certainly I think anyone going through them, simplifying assistance for the severely handicapped, those things seem like no-brainers, and but the government's going to have to work to pick those things out.
Tyler, Alberta is going to be reviewing e-cigarette usage as doctors will report all vaping-related illnesses. Now, this follows a couple of hundred lung issues in the United States, including a couple of deaths.
Yeah, it's real alarming. I think an awful lot of parents and teachers are keeping a really close eye on this, concerned about youth vaping rates and things like that. And I have to admit, I'm 30, and it's funny to me because when I was a teenager, we worried about taking up smoking cigarettes, and there are, as you say, several hundred illnesses. These are. I am of the opinion, which this is strictly my opinion, not as a doctor or anything, but we are still talking a very, very small percentage of overall use. We just had reported in Canada this week the first case, but we're talking one case in a country of 35 odd million people, and we're talking about vaping versus cigarette smoking, which is in Canada responsible for about 100 deaths per day. So there are obviously some concerns here. I think government and health officials need to move very, very, very quickly to sort of clear up what is causing this. I am a bit of a skeptic that people should be truly, truly freaking out about this, especially because you are starting to see some reports in the US of people returning to cigarette smoking because of some of this stuff. And not a doctor, can't imagine that's a good choice.
The Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me from Edmonton. Thanks again, Tyler.
Thanks, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at PCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks for watching.